to translate into jobs and economic opportunities for all Nigerians.
Okay, now let's come back to the basics. How do you define poverty? And I know why I'm asking that question. How do you define poverty? How is poverty calculated in Nigeria? And how is Nigeria's poverty different from other countries' poverty, if there is a difference at all?
Okay. So I'll try to explain it as kind of clearly and simply as possible, recognizing that the whole issue of poverty measurement has actually gotten quite technically complex. But the idea behind it is very simple. First of all, there are many definitions or notions of poverty. I mean, it has to go with people's sense of, whether or not they're well off, how contented they are. But the basic measure or not concept of poverty that the World Bank focuses on as our first and core mission is, do people have enough to meet a very basic bundle of human needs? So enough food, like 2,100 calories a day for each person. Clothing, shelter, basic access and ability to afford health, education services, right? Housing. So that basic, what we call the basic needs approach, is something that measures of calculations of how many people are extreme poor. It's pretty standard across many nations. And in fact, the NBS here in Nigeria, that's what they base their calculations on as well. So when we hear that the 2018-2019 National Nigerian Living Standards Survey said that 40% of the population is poor, I would actually say extreme poor. What that means is that 40% of the population, based on this large nationally representative survey, were not able to meet, basically did not have the incomes to spend enough to meet what it would cost for this basic bundle of needs. And there the technicalities come because you have to say, well, meeting that basic bundle of needs in Lagos is going to be, what it's going to cost is going to be very different from
the north,
some part of Jigawa State, right? So that's where the technical adjustments to make sure you're looking at adjusting for price differences, and then also, a household with, 7 family members, 2 adults and 5 children, their needs will be somewhat different from a household with, 3 adults and 4 children who are maybe young adults, right? So those kinds of adjustments also have to be made. But at the end of the day, what the basic kind of statistic that emerged from the NLSS, and that's in the NBS report, is that 40% of the Nigerian population was assessed not to be able to meet the cost of this basic bundle of needs.
And the costs are around those 3 factors which you've mentioned: caloric requirements, that's food, monetary expenditure in terms of how much, then perhaps non-food expenditure. Yes. I hope our Nigerians are understanding. I'm trying to break this into the basic level as much as I can. So looking at the monetary side, because a lot of analysts, and even I also quote the World Bank in terms of, okay, for you to live in extreme poverty, $1.93 a day. Is it still within that band, or is changed?
So the $1.93 is it's a related but somewhat different measure in the sense that that's expressed in terms of prices that are comparable across countries. So what I would encourage all, people who are interested and passionate about, what is the cost of meeting basic needs in Nigeria as of 2018?
137,000 naira a year per person.
So now that's an average.
By 12 years.
Yes. So say it's about 1,200 or 1,100. Yes. naira per person per month. Okay. Sorry, 11,000 naira per person per month. Now, keep in mind that that's an average across the different parts of Nigeria where the cost of basic items will vary. So in Lagos, it might be a bit more. In parts of the north, it might, or northwest, it would be a bit less. But that's a rough number. 137,000 naira per person per year. Okay.
That's about 11,416 naira per month per person. But just like you said, it differs in the regions or in the states.
Yeah, so you have to make adjustments, and part of what the NBS does in coming up with this 40% figure as the overall poverty rate for Nigeria, they made those adjustments. They said, okay, what fraction of the population lives in, say, the Northwest? What are the prices there? And therefore, what is this poverty line? And how many people are actually below that poverty line? And that's what gives you can get a very detailed picture of what fraction of the population is unable to meet the cost of basic needs in each state. And in fact, you can take it further down, often to the local government level. Okay.
Okay, the rich and the poor. Oh, yeah, the very rich, the rich and the
well off.
Yeah.
Okay, are not only able to meet these basic needs, but actually can go beyond that. And you know, and in the developed economies, that used to be the middle section of the population, right? About where people are in terms of, you know, how well off they are. The middle class defined in this way of being well off enough to lead comfortable lives. The middle class in Nigeria is actually not in the middle of the population. They're towards the top end.
So that's why I asked.
Yeah, it's towards the top end.
Yeah.
So in Nigerian terms, the middle class, you know, people who own a car are able to send their children to private schools and afford private health care and have a nice house, decent house to live in. You know, they may consider themselves middle class,
or they're not.
In the Nigerian context, they're actually at the top end.
So the rich, the very rich, and the poor. So there's no middle class, as it were. Shubham.
We could keep talking about this.
Shubham, I see you're struggling to answer this question.
No, it's just because there's an absolute notion of, if you talk to, say, someone who's higher up in the civil service or in the media, talking to an editorial board, you'd be surprised by the standards you just used. They should consider themselves rich because relative to the bulk of the Nigerian population, they're better off.
Yeah.
But it's not as if they're rich when you think of someone who is, you know, jetting off somewhere or you know. So that's why there are some people or many people in Nigeria who are truly rich by global standards.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
So when I talk to the editorial board of a major newspaper, they're middle class by some measures, by their own thinking. They're solidly middle class. By Nigerian standards, they're much better off than the bulk of the population, but they're certainly not rich by global standards.
Yeah. Yeah.
You see what I mean?
Yes,
That's why the distinction.
I get it. Yes, because if you put them, just suppose them between or amongst other countries, in absolute terms, like in dollar terms, they are not. But in the Nigerian terms, they are well off. Okay. So what is the difference between poverty and inequality in Nigeria? What's the difference, really?
So this actually goes to what we were just discussing, which is the way that the World Bank, you know, when we talk about poverty, we are actually starting with very basic, you know, are people able to meet their absolute basic needs? Okay? And so you could have a highly unequal, very high level of inequality, but you may have very little poverty. right? Because everyone is able to meet their basic needs. Imagine a country where everyone is able to meet their basic needs, but there's some who are fabulously rich, right? Whereas the others are just barely above this poverty line, right? So that would be a country with very little poverty and very high inequality, right? And now, in a country like Nigeria, you have both high levels of poverty as well as high levels of inequality.
So we are plagued by the two.
Yes.
Actually. Okay, let's take a look at this report. Let's try and unpack it as much as we can. I see that my team has been flashing images from the report. What do you think are the drivers of poverty in that report? You know, what do you think are the drivers? Just try and unpack that report in simple terms.
So, if I may, let's take one step back and just look at the historical experience globally, you know, of how countries have managed to eliminate poverty and then really make the entire population prosperous. You know, in China, the language they used was actually that their aspiration was not to lift people, not only to eliminate poverty, but to make everyone moderately well off. Okay. So what has it taken? And so countries like China or many countries in Asia, it's ultimately it comes from private firms creating jobs. Okay. So wage employment, which is kind of good jobs for the bulk of the population. Okay. Which means people coming out of self-employment, especially self-employment that's just very much at the subsistence level, right? So that's what it takes. So if you think about in Nigeria, ask about the drivers of poverty, I would link it back to what has kept the Nigerian economy from having that kind of dynamic private sector that where, you know, firms are being created, are growing, are kind of creating jobs, almost sucking, you know, like a magnet, drawing people out of the informal hustle, you know, having to hustle and saying, okay, here's a good job that you can rely on that gives you enough to put your kids in school and etc. So to why that is, but also in terms of how easy it is for private firms to operate and grow. Okay, has to do with exchange rate management, has to do with the business environment overall. Second has to do with infrastructure, right? It's hard for a firm, even with the best ideas, to grow if they don't have access to power, if they can't transport the human capital that the labor force in Nigeria has. Okay? We did a study in, I think it was in 2018, where the World Bank introduced something called the Human Capital Index. It said, a child born in a country today, if the country remains in kind of this level of services is what it is today, how much human capital would that child have when he or she enters the labor force at age 18? So we call that the Human Capital Index, right? It's a measure of
education,
quality of health, education, etc. On that, Nigeria ranked 6th lowest in the world, okay? And so it's the investments in human capital. So if you think about what explains the large number of Nigerians who are still poor or near poor, it's basically the fact that investments in human capital have been lacking, and because private firms have not been able to grow and flourish to create those jobs. And which means infrastructure, means policy reforms. Now, the infrastructure part and the investments in human capital part lead me to one of the other messages in this report, which is these are things that only government can provide. And for that, government needs, so government can do policy reforms, absolutely, but that requires consensus, trust, political will. But to invest in infrastructure, to invest in human capital, you also need fiscal resources. And that's where the choices that one makes about where to, how to mobilize revenues, but also how to spend them. Are PMS subsidies the best use of the limited fiscal resources that Nigeria has? I mean, that ultimately is Nigeria's choice. But we cannot help pointing out that, compared to the 4 or now possibly 4.5 trillion naira that will go towards PMS subsidies, this year, calendar year 2022, could those be used to prepare every Nigerian child, make sure they have a quality education? The COVID shock, COVID crisis, actually there's a clear drop in learning because kids were held home.
At home.
Yeah.
So you talked about COVID-19 changes, that's inflation exacerbating. So if our Nigeria is the largest contributor to poverty in Africa, one can say, okay, because of our population also. If we take a look at what you said, structural factors, so poverty is so powerful because of structural breakdown. So where you see a structural build-up, poverty also tends to reduce. You talked about fiscal management earlier. Would you want to, okay, I think you alluded to that fact around PMS. Now you also talked about the narrative in China, for example, when they did say lifting people out of poverty to be well off. Do you think that the narrative we have in Nigeria is also a bit skewed around poverty reduction? Because poverty reduction is also different from economic prosperity, or poverty reduction is different from wealth creation, so to speak. So do we begin to also change that narrative? And if we change the narrative, it will help us psychologically change the kind of policies around market forces, being more efficient or being more effective around what you've just said also. Do you think the narrative, because it's about, okay, we'll give you 5K, we'll give you 10,000 naira. And I'm really surprised because even within COVID, we know a lot of trillions of naira have gone into poverty alleviation. Ministry of Poverty, Humanitarian Affairs, Social Development, Disaster Management have been doing, humanitarian work and doling out cash. So how do you think that we should address it?
So I think, Nancy, what I would say is that it's more that the narratives have to be linked.
Okay.
So in the sense that you need prosperity, but you need prosperity for all. So if there's a risk, and it has been the case in some countries, that if the focus is on creating prosperity, by which you mean economic growth, it often ends up leaving the majority of the population behind.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because even when Nigeria was growing, sorry to cut you short, when Nigeria was growing, even from your report, the wealthy became wealthier. So
therefore, but on the other hand, the narrative about poverty reduction has to be linked to the narrative on growth and prosperity, just from that basic fact that I mentioned. No country has eliminated poverty without private firms growing and flourishing, which is the prosperity narrative. Right? So to think that poverty reduction is not only about palliatives, okay, and it's certainly not about the public sector creating more jobs. Hiring more people. Right? It's about combining, some measures, like I think there are social assistance is needed at times of crisis, with the longer-term effort to create prosperity by enabling private firms to grow and prosper.
Now, Shubham, if we take a look at what's happening in other parts of the world, especially the US now, some other developed countries, where they're trying to take wealth from the wealthy and transfer to the poor. We've seen that narrative in the United States. Do you think it can work here? Especially, I know that some of the wealthiest amongst us are into charity, like the Dangotes, for example, Dangote industry doing roads and all of that. Should we also be having that kind of conversation to reduce poverty? I think necessarily to create wealth, but to reduce poverty?
Yes. So I think that conversation is worth having, but in two tracks. One track is to say, look, how can Nigerians, and especially Nigerians who are well off or even wealthy, contribute more to increasing the fiscal resources of the state? So one of the other facts that we keep coming back to, the government revenues in Nigeria are among the lowest in the world, right? So I think especially well-off Nigerians have an obligation to kind of think about how can they contribute through taxes, etc., as do the middle class and the wealthy all over the world. The second track has to be about questioning that the resources the government does have, how is it being spent? And is it this calculation, a rough estimate, only about less than 5% of that 4.5 trillion will really result in benefits for the bottom 40%. of the population. The rest will be for the wealthy.
For the wealthy. We've been saying for ages, and I don't know if we're ready to do. We go front, 10 steps backwards. But let's take a look at subnationals now. The last NLSS data, Jigawa, the poorest states, about, I think, Jigawa, Sokoto, Taraba, around the 80%.
Right.
Lagos, about 4.5% poverty, 6% for Delta, and some other states. How do you think that the states or the subnationals, what can they do to, I don't want to be caught saying reducing poverty now. I don't want to have that mindset anymore. I want to talk about, economic issues, getting them right. So take a look at the subnationals.
So I think, and I've said this on many occasions.
Sorry.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
I've said this to all the excellencies, the executive governors at the Nigeria Governors Forum. The states are actually on the front lines of almost everything that needs to be done, whether we talk about reducing poverty or creating economic opportunities. So investing in human capital, making sure healthcare, basic education, creating the space for private firms to grow. That's also with the states. So in our measure, it's at the subnational level where whether you call it reducing poverty or whether you call it creating economic opportunity for all, the states are on the front lines. And the states can actually do a lot. And here again, Indonesia, India provide nice examples of how a lot of the momentum